here, and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lori. Thank you, Sarah. To everybody here with PPAC, old friends, family, new friends. I'm really glad to be here. I just want to make sure, because we're all connecting virtually, that you can hear me all right, because I got these new headphones. Okay? Good. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about my book, A Wall of Our Own, An American History of the Berlin Wall. I'm going to share my screen in a moment. It's a book that I spent over 10 years researching and writing and thinking about while in Berlin and a few other cities, and then coming home to Philadelphia to finish it. And I think, in my work, I look at border walls and monuments and how artists help us understand generational forms of social change, how to take some of the most painful, traumatic, and unjust stories and places and sites and aim to not just mark them, but really to confront them and to be democratic visionaries. And when I started this project, I wanted to write 10 different books. And I was in graduate school, and I wanted to approach all these things, and where I found a crossroads for all these ideas was the city of Berlin. I'm a Jewish queer person who did not grow up dreaming of writing about Germany. It was told to me in my communities that it was a place of pain. And, in visiting as a college student and later as a graduate student, I actually, of course, encountered the stories of trauma and of violence, but also a city in Berlin and people who were really coming to terms with some of the most weighty history and finding all these ways to move forward by having forms of memory live with them and art at its center. And I always thought, Berlin moves back and forth between these different cycles of freedom and repression. And I kept realizing I was not the only one doing this. And so the story of this book, which I'll share with you in a moment, is a story of a few American Berliners. But I want to bring this up in a few ways. One, before I begin, I'll share my screen so you can at least get the cover of the book here as we talk. Can you see the cover here? Let's do full screen. All right. So first, I want to just say for tonight, a person that's really important to this photograph and this story is Bridget Freed. She's Leonard Freed's widow and the one who printed these photographs. And Bridget's feeling a little bit under the weather right now, so I'm just sending good energy out to Bridget because she's really a key thought partner in my work. And of course, to Jamel Shabazz, the photographer and dear friend whose work I first encountered it as a college student, but I'm reading his one of his books in a dedication to one of the first photographic books he saw, Leonard Freed's Black and White America, which I'll show you. I just want to kind of point out that my work is not as an art historian. I'm trained as a historian and a curator, and I use the work of artists to tell history. And so you sometimes learn the best history and the best approaches to dealing with the challenges and struggles of history by looking to artists and learning with artists. So I'll begin there, and I'm going to take you on a kind of arc of this project and explain how the photograph you're seeing here on the cover of this book was taken in Berlin days after the wall went up. And it's the photograph that inspired this book, my dissertation, but also really what began my work as a curator, to understand how a photograph taken without the intention of knowing where it would go led to some of the most important conversations for one photographer, but also signaled a broader history as well. So the name of the book is A Wall of Our Own. And A Wall of Our Own, it comes from a speech said in Berlin by an American politician with a last name named Kennedy. But it's not from the speech Ich bin ein Berliner in 1963, said by President John F. Kennedy. It was his brother who actually went to Berlin while the wall was up before him in February of 1962. And just as a quick refresher, after World War II, the defeat of Nazi Germany, the four powers, the US, the British, the French, and the Russians split up all of Germany and then the city of Berlin. And the three Western forces, the Americans, British, and French joined their forces. And soon after, we entered into a Cold War with Russia. And there was no wall for the first approximately 15 or 16 years. There was much antagonism between the two superpowers. And in August of 1961, in the middle of the night, East German government with Soviet help encircled West Berlin's Allied sectors. So that's August of 61. And by February of 62, the Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, goes to Berlin. And he does all the things that we're very familiar with. Like he goes to, at that point, he sees the wall and he looks over it into East Germany. He's from the West Side. He's greeted by 100,000 West Berliners. And at the end of the day, he gives a speech at the Free University, founded with American support in 1948. And he gives a speech talking about the Cold War and how the other side is bad and we're good. But he also says this. He says, for 100 years, despite our protestations of equality, we had, as you know, a wall of our own. It's a wall of segregation erected against Negroes. In his words, the wall is coming down. I just read this and I thought, his government, his administration is both talking about this in the past tense as if the oppression happened in the past, but is perpetuating it in the same moment. And at the same time, it was a rare moment of reflexivity to say, hey, I'm here to talk to you about democracy from the West, but we have our own wall. And I thought this was remarkable, but then I thought back, this is 6 months into the wall being built. And I look back, and from the days that the wall went up, African-American artists, activists, journalists called attention to the contradictions of the Cold War, which is that we were guarding democracy abroad, but practicing segregation back home. Here, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier. I looked on, and when you look in the African-American press, you would see these scenes here, the Atlanta's Berlin Wall, No Warsaw Ghetto, Open Peyton Road. We're talking about either physical boundaries across American cities that mark segregated lines, or the understanding of de facto segregation. The violent, yeah.
Sorry to excuse you. Are you advancing in the slides?
I am.
Okay, so I think—
Can you see it now?
No, I think what you should do is unshare and reshare. And then try to start the slideshow. Yeah, unshare and reshare, because we weren't advancing.
Here we go. And maybe, can you see it now?
Yeah, and just press—
Maybe I'll just do it like this. Is this a little bit better? Can you see it move?
Yeah, that works. But so the play button didn't work, eh?
Okay, there we go. So you can see this one of Atlanta's Berlin Wall?
Got it.
Okay, thanks for calling that out. Got it. So I just wanted to call attention to like this story across a lot of American cities, where there's either an actual wall or a fence or the symbolic ones. Here in Philadelphia, Martin Luther King in 1965 talked about the wall around Girard College, and he said that this is symbolic as the Berlin Wall is symbolic. In Selma, Alabama, on the long struggle to march to Montgomery to guarantee for Black residents the right to vote, one day the public official tied a rope across the street, and residents and protesters started singing to the tune of Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho, "We've got a rope that's a Berlin Wall." So I want to bring all this up because if you know about the Berlin Wall in this, and if we were in a room together, I'd ask who has a piece of the Berlin Wall at home and where do you keep it? You know, there are certain stories that rise to the fore. Ich bin ein Berliner, tear down this wall. But I wanted to try to tell a different story, one that took into account the incompleteness of freedom, the barriers of democracy that live in the United States, and how, looking from an artist's perspective, we can understand that. And it all started with this photograph. And this is a photograph that I first read about, if you can see, and I saw it as a thumbnail online. And I wrote in my grant application, as many of us do when we write grant applications and we hope we'll find something out and we're not sure, I'm going to Berlin this summer to find more about Leonard Freed's work. And I really did not have any idea how I would do that. And I really lucked out in serendipity that Leonard Freed's retrospective worldview was on display at the CO Museum in Berlin. And I went, I saw this photo, the same week that I saw candidate Barack Obama speak before his first presidential election. And I was with my dear friend, Carmen Wynett, who's a celebrated photographer. But back then we were just like kids kicking around Berlin. She lent me money to buy my first Leonard Freed book, and it started from there. And in this image, which was really important in Leonard's oeuvre, and I had never seen in person, when you see something in person, a photograph like this, you see details. So I saw the wall behind this unnamed African-American soldier. I saw another photographer in the frame looking elsewhere. I saw this "You are leaving the American sector" sign. And it haunted me. And I tried to learn as much as I could about this photograph. And this is what kicked off the project. And so when I looked into it, I found out a number of things. One, I found other photographs of the Berlin Wall. If you can see here, the famous Leap of Freedom taken by Peter Liebning in the days after the first erection of the wall, but you don't see a wall here. There's just barbed wire. And it's from the perspective of the fleeing of an East German soldier into the so-called Free West. But I also looked at all of Leonard's other photographs taken in Berlin. He went to Berlin in August of 1961. He was working on a book about German Jews who moved back to Germany after the Holocaust in the 1950s and 1960s. And when he heard news that the Germans were dividing themselves yet again, he went to Berlin. And many of his photos are stalking this area of the wall as we know it, though you don't really even see the wall. But he was drawn to American soldiers. And in most of the frames, he's taking them, most of the images, and you go back to his contact sheets, you see multiple frames. You see that he's really trying to figure out where to stand, how to gather, and most of the soldiers he interacts with are white. Leonard is white and Jewish, and so when he is in Germany, he's thinking a lot about the reckoning that German culture has to do after the Holocaust. But in certain contexts, especially multiracial spaces, Leonard is a white person, and he's navigating the complications and his own privileges around race. But when I tried to find the soldier image, I looked, and actually back in his contact sheets, it's a single shot. And what a single shot means, we're not on our iPhones, we're or in a different era, that you're not going to see the image you take for several days, if not weeks, if not months. And what you see here is a whole range. We'll get the phone will go in a second. And so it was amazing to see this. And what this did is affirm a story that Leonard told in the book Black and White America, where he included this image. And you can see what he says. It opens up this book about segregation in America. It's the only photo not taken in the continental United States. And it's arguably American soil because it's the edge of the American sector in Berlin. We, he, and I, two Americans, we meet silently and part silently. Between us, impregnable and as deadly as the wall behind him, is another wall. It is there on the trolley tracks. It crawls along the cobblestones, across the frontiers and oceans, reaching back home, back into our lives and deep into our hearts, dividing us wherever we meet. I am white and he is black. Now, I want to remind you that at the same time, Leonard is working on several books about Germany, where he is taking to task the kind of incomplete reckoning and reconciliation after the Holocaust. And he says, we have to care for German democracy in this moment. And on the flip side, he, after taking this photograph in 1961, goes back to his wife in Amsterdam, where they're living at the time. He's an expatriate. He says, I have to go back to America. America is sick with racism. I have to understand it. This, to me, is the contradiction of American culture. He goes back to the United States on 2 different trips, photographs in his hometown of New York City, in Brooklyn. That summer in 1963, he goes to the March on Washington. We did a book with his estate, with the Getty publications on his unpublished book, published photos from the March on Washington. And then the next year he comes back and does a road trip, starting in Baltimore the day that Dr. King is announced in the United States that he has the Nobel Prize, and then goes down through Washington, D.C., the first time Black residents have the right to vote, and goes down throughout the South. And he is interested in not just telling the story of segregation, but understanding the ways that white people and Black people either see each other or fail to see each other. The way that the white gaze, in one sense, can overtake and be a form of dominant control, But on the flip side, valuing Black life, Black contribution, Black beauty culture. Some of the photographs from Leonard's work have been included in projects by Dr. Deborah Willis, Imposing Beauty. And I think that there's something really important about Leonard's work, and what he's navigating is back and forth, this idea of when he is an insider, when he's an outsider. And as I write about in the book, trying to find a middle distance, to not, on one hand, escape from the implication of being in the photograph or implied by the photograph, but also giving enough space to recognize and meet his subjects with a kind of deference or understanding that there is a buffer between them. This is the only image in the book in which that distance is fixed between him and his subjects. And throughout the rest of the book, the depth of field closes in, and he's really doing the work of encroaching upon the color line. That led me to other stories, and anyone I wanted to write about, essentially any artist, from Nina Simone to Paul Robeson, David Bowie to Keith Haring, Michael Jackson, got Alvin and the Chipmunks, like everybody had a Berlin Wall story. So I went back and tried to look, who are the American Berliners? Who are the people that felt at home in Berlin but haunted by Berlin? And they went to Berlin to understand division in America, especially racial division, racism, sexism, homophobia, more clearly. Angela Davis is one of those people. Angela Davis goes to Germany for the first time as a college student when she's on exchange, and then goes back to be a graduate student studying at the noted Frankfurt School. And in her autobiography, which is edited by the late Nobel laureate Toni Morrison, she shares about her encounter in the city of Berlin. And she talks about the fact that while she was a student in West Germany, she visited West Berlin with her fellowship group, she felt more at home in East Berlin. And in part, it was, of course, meeting with friends and family from Birmingham, James and Esther Jackson, traveling members of the Cuban National Ballet. But it was also her experience at the border, where she felt like she had more solidarity from border guards seeing her and recognizing her than she did from the waves of white tourists chanting the words of Ich bin ein Berliner. But in her book, and actually anywhere else that I could find, she did not articulate the phrase Berlin Wall. She talked about the wall in her autobiography, in scare quotes. This is a book that's dedicated to people behind walls. There are chapters that are titled Walls Turned Sideways or Bridges. She references walls all the time, but she's talking about the walls of mass incarceration and her experience as a political prisoner in the United States. I couldn't actually find a reference to the wall, and I think in part it's because she was a celebrated honorary citizen of East Berlin. And in East Berlin and East Germany, there was no wall. There was an anti-fascist protective rampart. The wall was not something that was talked about. It was not part of custom. It was really forbidden from sight, let alone from language. And so in a way, she's honoring East German conventions. But it's just fascinating because I've still tried to trace it. In fact, as late as 2010, when she does a public dialogue with Toni Morrison at the New York Public Library, they're talking about walls. And Toni Morrison brings up the Berlin Wall, not once, but twice. And Angela Davis answers her in full, but never says the words Berlin Wall. And so I wanted to look at what other walls was she pointing us to by not saying the wall. But at the same time, how do we understand this in like her broader political imagination? So I found other images of her in East German archives that are available today. And it's just fascinating to see. And a lot of people say to me like, oh, are those propaganda images? I have to say, I'm not as interested in knowing, in saying like what is and what is not propaganda, because we'd have to apply the same logic to the Western press and Radio Free Europe and all kinds of other things. But what I am interested in is seeing how a solidarity movement for her freedom involved East German state officials and East German children. And there is a love and appreciation that extends even to this day. At the same time, there are photographs of her by what we would call the wall, like the Brandenburg Gate. There's even guard towers and the wall itself. And maybe it's the fate of photography. You never see her facing it. But you do see in East German publication, she says, I am going to take home the stories of you border guards who are heroic and tell the true story to the American people. I just found it fascinating for someone who's a visionary prison abolitionist. Like, the wall was not visible to her, or at least she strategically did not want to bring it up in this book or anywhere else. Shinkichi Tajiri is another person I focused on. I found out about him through Leonard Freed's family and through Shinkichi Tajiri's daughters, Ryu and Giota, who have been really generous interlocutors. And I found out that Ria Tajiri, I think a niece of Shinkichi, is actually a temple professor as well. Shinkichi is very special as a figure. And he grew up in the United States and turned 18 the day of the Pearl Harbor attacks. His family lived in Southern California, and as the U.S. government turned against Japanese American citizens and rounded them up into American concentration camps, Shinkichi's family lost their home. He gained freedom by fighting for the U.S. military in World War II, and while he came back to the United States, he said he still felt like he was the enemy. And so he took his GI Bill money and he left the United States for the better part of his life. He never renounced his citizenship, but he made home elsewhere. And in part, it was settling first in Amsterdam and nearby it in Barlow, where he and his family set up shop in a former castle and built a foundry. But he decided to teach in Berlin in the 1970s and 80s. And he did not have his foundry. He had a great arrangement. 2 weeks a month, he would live in his studio and be available 24/7. You can see him here with a tent where he would see people all the time. And the other 2 weeks, he would go home and raise his daughters and make big sculptures. But while Shinkichi was in Berlin, the wall was the most interesting sculpture in the city. So he set out to document it photographically and to kind of scale it in a way. And this was a time where more and more artists would go to Berlin. Joseph Beuys famously said the Berlin Wall shouldn't come down. It should just be raised 6 centimeters to have better aesthetic proportions. And this is not a time yet where graffiti is famous on the wall. And so actually Shinkichi ended up documenting the renovation of the shoddy wall, this kind of, ill-fated infrastructure, like from the Western side more so than any other source. But what I found interesting is that when you look throughout these scenes, you see all of these leaving the American sector signs. These are made from a time when there was no wall, but they've been left behind. And like throughout his work, what you end up seeing is the way in which sometimes there are renovations and the sign got pulled up and it's sitting there. It looks like any construction that you see around any major city. And I think there's something mundane about the work. There's something that conjures his memory of being interned in the United States. He is reckoning with the history of American military throughout the rest of his life. And in fact, posthumously was awarded a Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Obama as being a member of the Nisei soldiers, the people who fought for their freedom while their families were imprisoned in camps. Shinkichi was fascinated by the wall. I don't think I can show it to you here. I'll try. He flew over the city in a helicopter with a giant Sony Portapack, 200 meters away, 200 meters above, 200 meters of tape. He made these giant panoramic shots with a Widelux camera, and he printed them on linen, and he called them Berlinens. And then later on, he kept going back to the city of Berlin. He actually had an art opening the night of the wall was breached in November of 1989 and continued to go back. When I visited his studio, he's now passed away, but his studio is intact. There are pieces, big chunks of the wall lining the windowsill. And then finally, the last subject I focus on is the poet, Black lesbian mother writer, Audre Lorde. And Audre Lorde, despite facing many kind of urgencies in her life in 1984, she had just returned from her parents' native land of Grenada, which was invaded by US troops that she wanted to survey the land. She was editing the pages to her first book of essays, Sister Outsider, which is now a classic and a must read. And she was facing a likely prognosis of cancer. And she said, I'm going to actually still go to Europe and follow up on a commitment I have to teach at the John F. Kennedy School in Berlin. And the people around Audre Lorde, her partner, Gloria Joseph, her friend, Dagmar Schultz, who was a filmmaker behind the work, Audre Lorde, the Berlin Years, said that Berlin added years to Audrey's life. She was prolific there, but she also faced really intense points of challenge. She was put on Iscador, which is a kind of mistletoe, homeopathic treatment that alleviated her. She wrote poetry. Famously, Berlin is hard on colored girls. This urn contains the earth of German concentration camps. She was fascinated by the ways that German white women, German Jewish women, Afro-German women would communicate to each other or not, and is credited as one of the founders of the Afro-German movement. And she only went to Berlin for 7 years of her life, but it is actually one of the places where her ashes are spread now. Berlin is thought of as this very intense place for her. What I kept finding was artifacts of joy, of curiosity, but also of her critical eye. Here's a party in the lesbian party series Beginner, and like find these, I've read her journals from both published and unpublished that are at Spelman College and also at the John F. Kennedy School in Berlin. And she would say, dancing the night away can brings you joy in Berlin. But also, she's confronting the legacy of anti-Semitism, the attacks on Afro-German and German-Turkish people. And so what I found in her writing that's mostly published are the stories about other people. When you look at the drafts and you look at her, even her photographs, you see her wrestling with what it means to be in Berlin. And in her archives, I found these snapshots that she took in the city. And, you know, I have to say, for those who visited Berlin and you're taken by the ground, the hard edges of the city, I found several snapshots of her taking photographs of like German sidewalks and roads. And you can see in her Berlin poetry, she talks about the texture of the city. The view in the bottom left-hand corner with the flower is out of her apartment in Thiel Park in West Berlin in a park. And she writes a lot about this space as a space of healing, but also of separation. I could find two images that kind of place her in a global political context. I know that she went to East Berlin to meet with East German writers, but I couldn't find poems reflective of that. But the image on the top right is in Alexanderplatz, and it's the world clock that you can see at a distance. You can still see that structure today. And then the bottom right hand corner, I saw this image dozens of times, but looking at it with a closer look, I saw that there's I'll see if I can zoom in here for you, a giant mural in the background. This is, you know, Einwillt Frieden, Hände weg von Nicaragua, hands off Nicaragua. And so while she's in Berlin, you can see it in the way she talks and the way she shares. She's thinking about, at that point, US Cold War policy and intervention into Latin America. So Audre Lorde's global crossings, whether it was in East and West Germany, South Africa, contesting apartheid, Latin America, these are the crossroads of Berlin. These are the stories of Americans in Berlin that I kept finding in these examples and others. And again, you can see this in her work, and I should say, like Angela Davis, before 1989, I never saw her use the words Berlin Wall. She would say, the wall. I'm listening to what fear teaches me in a land where, orange poppies, what should you say? The bruised leavings jump an insurmountable wall where the glorious Berlin chestnuts and orange poppies hide detection wires that spray bullets which kill. After 1989, she starts using the phrase Berlin Wall to caution against the violence that Afro-German and Turkish people experienced in this wave of freedom, right? And I think she wrote open letters with her partner to the German chancellor and other poems that pushed us. I'm going to close in a moment, but I want to kind of say a few final things. What I found fascinating about this group of people is that after the wall was dismantled in November of 1989, they didn't stop going to Berlin, and they didn't stop having these encounters that are encapsulated in photography. Leonard Freed photographed an East German soldier days after the wall was breached in November of 1989. He wrote a caption later Days ago, if this soldier smiled, he might be court-martialed or shot. Today is a different story. And I worked with the Freed estate very closely, and I had the great opportunity to do a book with the family and Steidl publishers in Germany and the Museum Folkwang, where I got to take Leonard's unpublished writing, looking back at 50 years of photographs of Germany, and put them into a book. It was the wildest weekend. If you've ever seen the documentary, How to Make a Book with Steidl, it's like a world famous photo publisher. It was a wild ride, but it was amazing to have this layered experience in Germany around these intersections. Angela Davis, I couldn't find stories of her mentioning the wall, but all of these other powerful moments. And when I say the wall, I mean the Berlin Wall, but I saw other walls, other boundaries. Here, several years ago, she spoke outside of a fenced-in area where refugees in Berlin had been contesting to have more rights and more free movement. And so yet again, Davis found herself on this front line of freedom and repression. And you can see powerful images of her now in the protests and the movement for Black Lives in Oakland. Shinkichi Tajiri went back to Berlin and was fascinated with the changing evolution of the wall and the kind of sculptural facade that it was evolving into, and the kind of breaks within it. And in his home, like I said, I found all these pieces of the wall. And I think that there's kind of ciphers for him to understand his relationship to American militarism. And then finally, Audrey Lorde, there's several images of her like laughing next to an open air market where people are selling pieces of the wall. She's there with her friends, Dagmar Schultz and Ika Marshall. But then this image, which is far more serious, which was taken by Dagmar Schultz, in front of the wall, not while it's an intact border, but you can see in the first free elections after. And she's very weary of the rise of right-wing populism and governance. And so what I love about this image is not only you get her in this moment of curiosity and criticality, but she has what appears like a small bag and perhaps a camera with her. And so I think for me, what I want to emphasize as I close, I'm interested in walls and monuments, not because I believe we need them necessarily, not because I believe they either save us or are simple, but because I'm really interested in the way that artists in particular are able to take interactions, engagements with those pieces of monumental infrastructure and dismantle them. And if they dismantle them, not in a day, but over a generation, they help us understand the social walls and boundaries between us. And I always thought, you know, there's pressure to say, like, I'm going to write a history of photographers at the wall, or I'm going to write a history of writers or musicians. And all those books would be fun. And please, someone go write that, because there's a great book about Nan Goldin and Richard Avedon and others that should be written about photography at the wall. I wanted to know more organically how artists working across different formats help us understand generational problems and therefore lead pathways for understanding and more enhanced approaches to freedom, both historically but also today. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Come on back.
Yay, that was amazing. Thank you, Paul. I forgot to say in the beginning, I'm a terrible introducer, but we're celebrating the launch of this book, A Wall of Our Own, which was just released last month. So I neglected to say that, but so congratulations on this book. We would love to hear your questions and make this a conversation. Please unmute yourself if you have something, if you want to add a comment or want to ask a question. And Michelle wonderfully put the link to the I think it's the How to Make a Book with Steidl. It's I don't know.
That's the document. That's the documentary. The book that we did is a new version of Leonard Freed's Made in Germany, with a special booklet called Reading Leonard Freed.
Well, the thing that is amazing to me about this book is how it's not complete, but it is, like you said, it leads to pathways for understanding, and I find that very inspiring, and it's a useful way to think about all of the things we face as a society, as a country, as a city. The fact that, you know, everybody can do a little bit and be thinking a little bit about how to understand the big problems that we create as well with each other.
Mhm.
There's a question, as a Jewish young person, how did you feel in Berlin?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And it was complicated, but really productive. So I think I would say the first thing I felt, you know, was a little bit of fear. Like, I try to say it like this. Like, sometimes I would walk in and I feel like, oh my gosh, I'm in Germany. It's like you're walking through gelatinous air. Or like, you know, if you ever get the feeling you're in a store and you're 99.9% sure you didn't shoplift, but you walk through the detectors and you're like, what if I did shoplift? And you feel like you've done something wrong. So I felt like that. But I started to have some other things, and I had a lot of revelations when I went to Berlin for the first time as a college student. I'm in 2004. One, I had been living in Europe, studying abroad. I felt more comfortable being Jewish in Berlin than I did anywhere else. And in part, I mean, a lot of Germans grew up speaking English as another language. I'm not even going to say second. I had more conversations about contemporary Jewish identity told with respect than I had in all the rest of Europe. And in part, that's tied to an educational system and mandates to talk about Jewish culture. I don't believe it's true everywhere of Germany, so I don't want to paint a picture like there is right-wing violence all over Germany as well. But my personal experience was one more of comfort. I was taken by the way that memory lived in the city. There were all these stumble stones, these small bricks that were put into the sidewalk, first as a renegade project and then a municipal one, where you'd walk down the street and you see these little bricks and you read them, and they're the names of Jewish people and other people who were deported during the Holocaust and murdered. And it says their name and it says where they were deported to and where they were murdered. And I just felt like, I mean, it was like outside the pizza store and outside my apartment. And it was no way to escape it. And then I went to the new synagogue, which is not a new synagogue, it's an old synagogue that was heavily bombed and destroyed and desecrated. And it was rebuilt, but the only thing that was not rebuilt was the chapel. And you walk through this beautiful, ornate, traditional looking synagogue and you just see a window into an empty gravel-filled lot. And I was just blown away by that. I said, like, presence and absence lived here together. The other thing that came up, I started thinking, well, I'm feeling like this as a Jewish person in Berlin. What does it mean to be Native American in the United States? Like, where would you go that you don't feel that same feeling that the air is heavy with pain and with trauma? If you're African American and you're going through not just a segregated South, but anywhere in the United States where discrimination is part of it, like, where would you go? And I thought maybe what I could do is learn from people who came to Berlin where the burden of history is heavy to understand America. And I remember thinking back then in 2004, wow, we've had hundreds of uprisings in the United States related to police brutality. And I've only seen a historic sign in one city, and I think about that. And I was not the first person to think that, but again, like, we're confronting that right now and having unrecognized suffering for generations. So Berlin for me was and still is a place where I feel haunted, and I also feel at home. And I realize other people feel the same way from all over the world, but especially Americans. It's that balance that actually gives you perspective.
Okay, Frank. I don't know if he wants to share a story, and then, but I don't know if we'll have time for photographs today because I want to make sure that we keep talking about.
If you,
I don't have photographs now. It's just a
okay,
very quick
but
story.
you can email them.
Okay. In 1969, I traveled on a train through East Germany to get to Berlin and was confronted by soldiers on the train who saw me taking pictures out the window and frightened me. I felt like it was the Gestapo, but they were representing the Soviet Union there. When I got to Berlin, I got there. The next day is when we landed on the moon, 1969. The next day, I crossed through Checkpoint Charlie to go into East Berlin. And it was fascinating and also scary. I, too, am Jewish, and I felt this fear, which I couldn't explain because nobody was threatening me for the most part. But I will get in touch with you in the future. So I may have some slides or some pictures that I took as I was in East Berlin.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's so powerful. And there's all these amazing stories and what it means to kind of walk and move back and forth between these spaces. And
I was 22 years old. I didn't know what I was doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anna?
Hi. Hi, Paul. Thank you very much for this. I have comments and questions about walls and memorials. And I'll start with the Stolpersteine, the largest dispersed memorial, I think, in the world, right? Which is the shields that you saw, which the name of which derives from an anti-Semitic saying, when you stumble in German, you say, well, you used to say, or some people used to say, hier eine Jude kann begraben sein. Here, a Jew could have been buried here. So the stumbling stones, as they're called, are named, and so it's problematic. That concept of the monument, which is very powerful, is very problematic because of the name, right? Yeah. And I'm thinking about, the reference, like you were talking about whether Angela Davis's appearances in front of the wall were propaganda. Of course, they were propaganda. I grew up in I'm a Soviet Jew. I grew up in the Soviet Union. I've never seen Berlin without the wall. I've seen Berlin from both sides with the wall. I was lucky enough to come out into West Berlin when I was a teenager, just before it fell. But Angela Davis was a big deal in the Soviet Union. She was a big part of the propaganda machine, and the Soviets, being extremely racist, had a very dirty ditty about her. That was probably how most people heard about her, was through this absolutely vulgar ditty. It's not even ambiguity of monuments and memorials. It's like the multifacetedness, right? You were talking about Tajiri trying to come to terms with how, like, what that wall is and what what being in Berlin is. The question, or rather, the question I have for you is what, as we're thinking so much about monuments and commemorations in this country, but also in the world right now, do you believe this? In Senegal, which has been independent for 60 years, there is now a real live animated discussion among intellectual and political and cultural elite whether or not to remove the monument to the French colonial governor who massacred people by the village, which still exists in Saint Louis, the former colonial capital of French West Africa. So what is the conversation? What is knowing about the wall and people having, and your preamble about like having pieces of the wall in your part? I mean, it's such a strange thing. Why would you have something like that in your space?
Yeah.
Where can we take that conversation into the now and into the future?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing, like you put a lot of life experience into just short anecdotes, and I know there's volumes more. So thank you for sharing that. I've been talking a lot about monuments and about the wall recently, in part because I think, there's a saying that goes with the piece of the wall. And I'll try to touch on a few things you said, but I may not get all to it, but I appreciate all that you said, which is that the wall pieces were self-evidently called pieces of history. And I mean that in terms of the label at the Smithsonian, they own pieces of the wall. The book 101 Objects, like America Explained, I saw the cover of the book a few years ago and I said, there's a piece of the wall in here. I didn't even know that the story would be that a future Goldman Sachs representative went in his 20s and with a duffel bag and like took pieces of the wall, and that's what's in the Smithsonian. But I bring it up because there's this notion that the pieces of the wall equal history. And I think it's not that they equal history, it's that but they're shorthand for it. So what's going on there? It's a temptation to say that history is more simple, that history has endpoints, that history is one-sided or if not two-sided, and that's it. And I think of the work that pieces of the wall have to do, even in museums and in public spaces around the country, very similar to monuments. Monuments are not history. Monuments represent the past, but monuments shape the past more than the past shapes a monument because they are stories. So if we change our framework to understand any of these repressive structures, especially I'm thinking of border walls, but you could also put Confederate monuments and other kind of monuments of colonial power. They're trying to convey a story about control, but they're just materials. And once they crumble and once they're demolished or once they're dismantled, they always become unintentional monuments to their own demise. And so I just think about this. And I also think about the pictures in Richmond right now, which are riveting, like some of the most important images, or at least meaningful to me, which is on the Monument Lab Instagram page or Twitter. You can see we did took a video of someone who 3D scanned it, and I think it looks like the Berlin Wall. And remember, the Berlin Wall was graffitied in the 1980s forward, including by people like Keith Haring. That's why I have the shirt. But it wasn't a precious space. It wasn't a gallery. It was instead, a lot of the graffiti that is on pieces of the wall was painted after 1989. In fact, I don't necessarily want to cheapen that. Like even today, there's one really surviving template that people utilize on Mauer Park. And the cover of the Berlin Morgen Post a few weeks ago had a mural a Caribbean German man put up of George Floyd on the piece of the Berlin Wall. That being said, just because it's historical doesn't mean that it holds all of history. And so what are other ways that we can understand history? Sometimes it's the actions on top of divisive infrastructure or the changes in them or their evolutions over time. History doesn't have endpoints. There is, unlike what Francis Fukuyama and conservative commenters called the end of history, the end of struggle in '89 didn't end history. It was a continuation, it was a pivot. So how do we, to quote the writer Ralph Ellison, think of history not as an arrow, but as a boomerang, and get your helmet because it's coming back around, right? So there's a lot going on there, but I just wanted to end with that.
But there's also an interesting thing happening. Once the Berlin Wall stops being functional, it becomes a monument. And once a monument becomes a backdrop for a projection and a piece of argument, a piece on the chessboard of argument, it becomes history, right? So these objects, they have this power of transcending from one to the other. Okay, I'll stop hogging.
Yeah, very fascinating. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
I did ask this before. When did Angela Davis go to Berlin? What year was that? When was her travels?
So as a student, she went in 1966 and 67. She lived in Germany and then left, went back to the United States. She went back to East Berlin in 1972, almost a few weeks after her trial, and she was in the midst of a tour of the Eastern Bloc, especially to countries that had participated in our solidarity campaign. The letter writing that went to the judge to free her on bail. The East Germans had a campaign, Million Roses for Angela, and she was writing her autobiography, according to Toni Morrison, that Angela did not feel safe in the United States to write. So she spent a lot of time outside of the country writing. And then I should also add, she went back in 73, she went back in 75, she finished her PhD at the in East Germany, and has gone back numerous times. She spoke at Occupy Berlin. She like a lot of the people I was drawn to. I mean, there's people who went once and I'm interested in, they got a footnote and they're really interesting stories. The people who were American Berliners, the people who by habit or kind of their own, by their own actions, keep going back to Berlin habitually. Those are the people I'm very interested in, as a kind of, we have these books about Americans in Paris, or if you were seeking the open road of the American West, you'd hit your car as a beatnik. I wanted to establish an understanding of Berlin, especially divided Berlin, or even continually the legacy of divided Berlin, as a place of American pilgrimage for artists and writers seeking critical distance.
Are you working on more of that? What are you working on now?
Well, I'm kind of, a lot of my work is on monuments, and I'm the, as Laurie said, co-founder and artistic director of Monument Lab, and we work around the country and now outside of the country on past, present, and future of monuments. We actually have a project sponsored by the German government right now, looking at transnational memory workers, so people around the world who are really trying to change the way we make monuments. And anywhere you see a monument removal, either by official decree or by people toppling it in the last few weeks, there's years of activism and organizing and artwork that goes around it. So that's something I'm working on. And I had been interested in trying to do a kind of similar project to this in Berlin Wall on the US-Mexico border. And if I don't do it, I hope someone else does. And there are people doing very similar work, which is looking at the changing landscape of the border fence and now increasingly border wall. And people like Ana Teresa Fernandez, artist Michelle Angela Ortiz, and others who are working to understand the dangerous and harmful and militaristic nature of that border, but also are working to dismantle it even before it's completed, and seeking to understand connection across those spaces.
I wanted to, because we're a photo talk, not a monument talk. No, I'm kidding. I wanted to see if you wanted to just talk a little bit about your passion for photography is wonderful, is incredible, and also the way you approach it. And one of the papers that you wrote, a critical paper that you wrote, was about the photography used in the Wire show, the series, and how photographs choreographed, like who knew what and who was left out. And do you want to talk a little bit about that passion in the study of photographs in the Wire and how it connects to all of these threads that you pull on and stories that you tell through the use of photography?
Yeah. So I would say, again, I'm not trained as an art historian. If anything, I'm like a feral art historian, because I like to really think about artwork in different contexts. I love going to museums. I love going to galleries, but I'd like to stumble upon things outside and understand them from different perspectives and contexts. And so I am interested in part in things like monuments, not because of them being on their own, but the way they're embedded in a landscape. And that's really how I came to love photography. And my first work as a curator was dealing with really not only finding out the history of that image of the Black soldier in Berlin, but whose identity I've yet to be able to find. I've gotten his battle rank. I've gotten members of his battalion. I've spent years finding it. I'd welcome knowing it, but his name tag is not blown up at the highest resolution, so he remains unknown. But I'm interested in some ways, like the moment that Bridget Freed handed me a folder that said unpublished German book that Leonard had left behind in his papers after he passed away. So when I saw the HBO show The Wire, and I would say this of a lot of TV shows, I started noticing that how photographs were kind of used throughout the series. Like they weren't just props, though they were elaborate props, but like they were really key pivot points. And so you could say the same, at least from my perspective. I don't watch a ton of TV, but I go deep when I do. Mad Men, The Watchmen, but then even other kind of shows, like you look at the desks of people and their wall collages. So with The Wire, I just looked for every instance of a photograph on the show. And what I found were Polaroids, snapshots on the walls of drug kingpins and police, middle management. And what I basically found was that if you were a police person, photographs held you had a magical power. It was both an art and a science that you would understand and be able to unravel things, and you would hold them. Like the character McNulty would like take a photograph and stuff it in his pocket, or you have the folder and wield it. And it's very much connected to the history of photography and policing, which is that police hold the art and science of photographs in order to implicate the criminal. What I saw on the other side, though, was happening throughout the show. People like D'Angelo Barksdale, if you know the show, someone who was, someone who had been involved in drug trafficking. He would hold on to photographs in the show, and he couldn't let go of them, and it was too sentimental, and it resulted in his demise. And then there were other characters like Omar, President Obama's favorite character, who had these Polaroids. He was a queer figure who had Polaroid pictures left in his apartment of him and his boyfriend. And when he had to like run and leave the apartment and hide, he left the photographs behind. So I actually think it's useful because of all the kind of cop shows that are getting a new critical eye now to understand who is being criminalized in these shows and who's being celebrated. Like The Wire is one of the greatest shows of all time. I'm not the only one saying that, but I'll have a good discussion with you about it. But still, on a show that's trying to critically unpack policing, if you are police, you have a magical power and you hold on to photographs to solve truth. And if you are anyone else, photographs mark your demise. They're your sentimentality. They're what you can't let go of. And yet, when you die on the show, because a lot of characters died, you keep living as photographs, and your photograph keeps hovering around, often as police fodder. And so it just creates, I think, maybe something for us to think about, which is, who has the power of photography to bring about change and empower themselves and identify themselves.
We're very close to the end, but Sebastian has a comment.
Hey, that would take another hour. So I'm just going to say thank you so much, and I'll email you. I feel really inspired, and I'm excited to read your book. This is super relevant to a current project I'm working on. I was raised by a Holocaust survivor. I've lived in Berlin, and I would love to hear you talk about what you think of the Jewish memorial there, and also, kind of the role that monuments play in the way that trauma is dealt with between generations, because that's really the focus of my current work. But that obviously is a longer conversation. So hopefully we can connect later about that. So if you have any quick comments about it, otherwise we can talk later. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And again, I appreciate, a lot of people have a Berlin story or Berlin experience. And if you don't, someone who does, or you have another city that you identify with, and it's part of the complication of understanding either American identity or other kinds of identities crossing over time. I would just say quickly that there are a number of projects about that particular memorial and photography that intersect. And I think it's a very photogenic place, and it's also a traumatized space. And so one thing I would just say quickly, there's a lot more to say about it, but is how do we think about the photography as a memory practice in of itself? There are the ways that people either, I think of Joel Sternfeld's work in particular, looking for sites that are marked by official decree, that there's a lot of money, time, and resources poured into them. And what I want to know in those cases, not Joel Sternfeld's cases, but I want to know about how people utilize them and how people make it their own, whether it's sacrosanct or sacrilegious, and how does it live and evolve. And for work like Joel Sternfeld or others who find sites of trauma that have not been marked, photography stands in. It's a way to say there is no monument, there is no marker, but I need to register this site or register how it lives in time in its own way. Photography is just as static as a statue, but the uses of photography, the transaction, the movement, the rearticulation, the framing, these are all things that lend themselves to kind of more dynamic exchanges as well.
Thank you.
More to say, but thank you.
I think it's time to close. Thank you very, very much, Paul. There's just no way to compress all that you bring into these conversations into an hour.
We try.
It was
Thank you,
great.
Paul.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And thank you everyone for coming. Next week, Brad McCollum is going to be the Thursday Night Photo Talk speaker. We've just put up the overview of his talk. So please go to PPAC's website and check out our next week's speaker. Thank you all for sharing this time with us. And I hope to see you next week. Thank you, Paul.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
thank
Paul.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night. Stay creative.
See you again. That's right. Thank you, PPAC.
Thank you, Paul.